Hello everyone, this is going to be 1.2, the West Africans. We're going to start with the primary source from Ali Umari, a Syrian historian from the 1300s, talking about one of the great West African kings, Mansa Musa, where he said Mansa Musa flooded Cairo with his benefactions. He left no court emir nor holder of a royal office without the gift of a load of gold. The Cairenes made incalculable profits out of him and his suite in buying and selling and giving and taking. They exchanged gold until they had depressed its value in Egypt and caused its price to fall. Mansa Musa, when he went on his pilgrimage, brought so much gold with him that he actually caused the price of gold to go down. That's a lot of gold. Anyway, we are going to talk about today our objectives. We're going to describe the development and cultural characteristics of West Africa in the 15th century. We're going to summarize the West African religions, culture, and society, and explore the roots of the system of slavery practiced in the Americas, and also how it differed from West African forms of human enslavement. So let's start with what did West Africa look like and kind of talk a little bit about why is this important to the story of Europe and America? Well, because they're all interconnected and interwoven. So, West Africa was, and still is, a very diverse area. First of all, you have the Sahara Desert up there in the north. In the south, you have rivers that connect throughout the south and west area. Good for farming, good for travel. If you're going to create a civilization, always create one near a river. That is, World History 101. West Africa also had a lot of stuff that people wanted. Gold was a huge part of that, but also salt, which was not easy to get to back in the old days and was really valuable because it kept your food fresh for long periods of time. And so this meant that West Africa turned into a trade center for the rest of the world. So first here, notice how close Egypt and North Africa are to the Middle East, and you might notice that the Middle East connects to Europe. This was a huge trade route, even through the Sahara Desert. So in West Africa, we had several large kingdoms. We had, first of all, Ghana. This was a powerful kingdom from about 300 to 1500 AD. They became most powerful about 800. And Ghana traded in things like gold. They used caravans to cross the desert. And the historians of the time talked about how they had huge cities and wealthy rulers. Once again, we don't often talk about West Africa when we talk about the great kingdoms in world history. At least I tried to a little bit, but oftentimes we talk about, Mesopotamia, we talk about Egypt if we talk about Africa at all. We talk about Greece and Rome. We leave out the fact that West Africa was a vastly important, very wealthy trade network for the rest of the world. Now, in that same area, eventually the Mali took over. The Mali took over after Ghana fell about 1200 AD. And like we heard, the most famous ruler of the Mali kingdom is Mansa Musa. He was probably, some people have said he's the wealthiest man who ever lived. He expanded westward, increased the role of Islam. He was a faithful Muslim, including the fact that he went on pilgrimage to Mecca. He also promoted scholarship, especially the scholarship that looked at the scholarship of Islam, where he created the university at Timbuktu, one of the largest cities of the time, one of the best universities of the time. And after his death in 1332, the kingdom weakened and eventually fell, leaving a new kingdom to rise in its place. So here is Mansa Musa, who lived from about 1280 to about 1337. Might notice little tildes there. That little tilde means that we think he lived from about this time to about this time. He was the ruler of the Mali Empire. Musa was his name. Mansa is his title. It basically means ruler. And like we said, he is quite possibly the richest person who ever lived. And according to Mansa Musa and the Empire of Mali, he was called, later historians, of course, Lincoln wasn't going to be alive for another 600 years, but he was the Lincoln to many of these people. So this is the mosque in Timbuktu. It was also a religious and learning center built by Mansa Musa in 1327. So you see, he built great works during his time. Lastly, we have the Songhai, who are around from about the 1400s up through later. They were the ones who were doing a lot of trade with the Europeans. They continued the Islamic tradition. They also continued getting rich off of trade. In 1468, they actually conquered the Kingdom of Mali and became the new power in West Africa. So, although the Ghani, Mala, and Songhai were all major empires, there were several other kingdoms throughout this area as well, and several other tribes that were doing business with Europeans as well. The Benin, for example, they promoted art, including what are called the Benin bronzes. These were taken by the British and now reside in the British Museum. The Hausa built several large cities in Niger and Nigeria. There were kingdoms that were famous for trade, for spices, for silk, not for silk, I'm sorry, that's Asia, for salt, for gold, and for cloth, what is known as kente cloth these days. Now, we look at some of the characteristics of West African society here. And like we talked about with the Native Americans, it's important to remember that there are a lot of different groups in West Africa. And so the worst thing you can possibly say is they all did this, or they were all like that. However, now that I've warned you about making generalizations, let's make some generalizations. They established communities through religious beliefs and family bonds. That is something that is generalized across many of these West African kingdoms. So, there were various religions in West Africa, a lot of animism, sort of like what Native Americans believed in. Eventually, Islam was brought to West Africa through trade from the Middle East. And there were some areas that did hold on to their spirit beliefs, very similar to the ones of the Native Americans. They also practiced ancestor worship, which promoted the idea that you should have a large family. A lot of family members was good, both socially and religiously. Now, also like Native Americans, there wasn't a whole lot of land ownership practice necessarily. Oftentimes, land belonged not just to you, but to your whole family. And often, villages would work land together, especially for farming, and pass out food as it was necessary at this time. Now, the owning of enslaved people or wives often determined a person's wealth, not the property that you had. Now, speaking of enslaved people, slavery was common during this time in West Africa. Along with gold and salt, also enslaved people were traded. They were often taken from if your tribe or if your kingdom conquered another kingdom in a war, they could be gotten that way. Or if you didn't pay a debt, or if you were a criminal and you were being punished. Some were actually traded all the way into Europe during this time. And slavery was brutal in West Africa. I'm not going to say, never would you hear me say that there was the quote unquote good version of slavery. There were different versions of slavery. However, this one was less harsh, I might say, in some cases. Slaves could marry into other families. Their children would not be slaves. Also, you could, in some cases, work off slavery. And it was also not based on the belief of racial superiority. This is what we're going to see when we get to European style enslavement, is that the people who are the enslavers and the people who are the enslaved is based upon the belief of social and racial superiority. So, how did the Europeans get into this story of West Africa? Through trade. In Europe, one of the first things that the first major trading countries that we see are the Portuguese. They are coastal, they're on the ocean, they're close to Africa, pretty close. And they traveled to West Africa in the 1400s. They had developed a new sort of ship called the caravel, and the caravel was faster, it was lighter, it was great for trade. They also had many nautical tools which they used to help themselves travel. They had the compass, they had the astrolabe. These are great for figuring out where you are. And many of these were borrowed from Arab traders that they met. And so we oftentimes think of the compass and the astrolabe as European. They were actually from the Middle East. and they were trading for gold, for ivory, for pepper, and for enslaved people. They made a lot of treaties with West African kingdoms in order to participate in the slave trade. They built forts to keep out any other European rivals and to defend their interests in slavery. The Portuguese ended up bringing about 1,800 slaves a year into Europe and also into islands that had been converted off the coast of West Africa into sugar plantations, places like the Azores. Now, once the Americas were discovered, we do see that more and more enslaved people are shipped there too. Especially to places like by the Portuguese, they were first put in places in the Caribbean, and also to places like Brazil had a large enslaved population. So here is what is called Goree Island off the coast of Senegal in West Africa. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner the slave fortress. So why is all this important? Well, first of all, we're trying to get an idea of what the entire world looked like and how the world was interconnected during this time. It was not just Europe was doing this, Asia was doing this, Africa was doing this. Europe and Asia and Africa are all connected, and since people from Africa, enslaved Africans, are going to be forced to play an integral part in this story, it's important to see where they came from and how they got to where they were. Lastly, trade with Africa and the riches of Africa was a major reason for the beginnings of European exploration, along with trade and riches in Asia, and we will see that in the next section.